Welcome to Empathy Empire, where we interview the most empathetic people on the planet. I'm your host, Kim Smiley. Adrienne Gold Davis is the Director of Experience and Engagement for Momentum and an international Jewish educator. She was a celebrated Canadian TV personality specializing in fashion, style, and beauty before making a major career pivot. Adrienne and I met at the Village Shul in Toronto, where she spent 15 years as a senior lecturer. Today, she hosts a top-rated podcast, Rise and Shine with Adrienne Gold Davis, and leads Momentum trips to Israel. She's married for over 30 years and has 2 grown sons. Adrienne, welcome to Empathy Empire. I am so happy you're here.
I'm thrilled to be here myself. Any time I spend with you is worthwhile, although every minute of my life I spend with you because I sleep in this jewelry.
I love that.
I love you. So I'm so thrilled to be here.
So let's start by talking about your career trajectory, because you've had an unbelievable career path.
Yeah.
You started on TV, fashion, beauty, and then you segued to become a top international Jewish educator.
Yeah, I call it from Prada to prayer. That's what I like to think of it as. And yeah, there were a lot of changes and a lot of evolution of who I am and what I stand for. But I have to be honest with you, since this is the Empathy Empire, I had very little empathy for myself. And I actually felt growing up that no one would notice me, that I was sort of invisible, that I was a 6, I would disappear. And my foray into fashion began as a response to that lack of self-esteem. And I thought that if I wore outrageous clothes and I had 2 different shoes and had ridiculous outfits, that people would notice what I was wearing, but not notice me. So in essence, I was hiding in plain sight. So what happened to me was I became so good at using fashion as not an accessory, but as a corrective necessity. I became so good at it that it began a career in something that lasted for a very long time and was very successful, despite the fact that its, pardon my pun, genesis was about self-protection. Weird, huh? How you can build a life on something nothing other than an insecurity.
How did it start, the career in fashion and TV?
Oh, gosh. Well, I was writing. I wrote a lot for Canadian fashion magazines. But mostly what happened was I was working as a management consultant for retail chains in the 80s when, all you had to do is look sideways and you could make money. And people would hire me to, increase sales in retail operations through merchandising and staffing and things like that. And one day, one of the owners of the company that I was working for, she was supposed to go and be on City Line. Do you remember City Line?
Of course.
In those days, gosh, was it Marilyn Dennis still? It was
Yes,
Marilyn Dennis. Yeah, she was supposed to go. And her kid got sick. Of course, as mothers, we understand that, the entire world comes to a halt when your kid gets sick. And she couldn't go. And they called me and said, do you mind going down? And of course, it was one of those days where you just wear your worst outfit and you have no makeup on, you have period zits everywhere. And I was like, I couldn't have looked worse. And I went down to City TV, which at the time was on Queen Street. And the producer said to me, just don't look in the monitor. In those days, you had a monitor so you could see yourself. Don't look in the monitor, meaning you don't look so great. Because, of course, there was no time for makeup, which was just... So there I was, completely exposed. And it so happened, I remember this first episode, it was Alfred Sung. Do you remember him?
Of course.
Alfred Sung, Simon Chang, and me. And I knew these guys from the industry. So I just decided I'm going to relax and I'm going to do what I know works, which is I'm going to emote from the inside out. I'm going to be all personality. I'm not going to look at the monitor. Otherwise, I'm going to see my 500 zits and my terrible dress and the fact that I never had time for makeup. And I was going to do all of that. And I did. And at the end of it, the producer said, you are really good. Will you come back? And I thought, sure, but next time I need makeup. And she said, no problem. We're going to call you. We're going to invite you back. So that was really the beginning. And it was also the beginning, Kim, I should tell you, of the endless, in those days, they were called faxes. Do you even know what a fax is?
I do.
Okay, so there were these endless faxes and phone calls to networks when I started to work saying, she's not very pretty, but we love looking at her. She's not so attractive. She could do to lose 20 pounds. But for some reason, we enjoy looking at her. And it's funny because I didn't understand the concept, the Jewish concept yet, of something called chen. Chen is this internal beauty that animates you. People became drawn to my vulnerability and openness. It's as though they could see my soul. And the reason they could see my soul was because I didn't think much of my vessel. So I never tried very hard to aggrandize that, except in my outfits. And I had chen, no beauty, but chen.
I would vehemently disagree with that
Well,
because
I do too.
I find you very physically beautiful.
Well, I thank you so much. I feel the same way about you, darling. No, seriously, today I am exponentially more beautiful at 65 than I was at 35. I can promise you that. And that is what I call the amalgamation of the internal world attracting and affecting the external world. So I am a balanced creature today. My insides are reflected on my outsides. I've worked very hard on my very flawed inner world.
So your insides and your outsides now match.
Yes, that's exactly it. Which, by the way, is the Jewish definition of something beautiful. Something cannot be called beautiful if the external and the internal oppose each other. In other words, no false advertising. In other words, something that you see has to be what you get. I was the antithesis of that, and now I'm not. So yeah, I'm pretty darn cute if I do so say myself. Maybe it's just my Kim Smiley earring thing.
No, it's all you.
Thanks.
You mentioned vulnerability.
Yeah.
And one of the things that really attracted me to you when I first heard you speak is that you were so vulnerable, you were so real, and there was no artifice. There wasn't a facade.
Yeah.
You spoke about having OCD. You spoke about when you first were married, how hard it was to be married and
Yeah.
assume that new role as a wife.
Yeah.
And it immediately disarms someone when the person speaking at a podium in front of them is so authentic and so real. Have you always been that person, or did you cultivate that over time as a teacher?
It's a good question. I would say, well, all of the recent research and the Brene Brown work over the last 10 years have said that there's a tremendous power in vulnerability. But one of the things I've noticed is what I call performative vulnerability. You see that often on social media pages and so on, where people expose and express their shtick in order to falsely create that bond. It doesn't work. You can fake it till you make it, but it doesn't work until you mean it. And for me, it did not feel so much like vulnerability for vulnerability's sake. For me, it feels like my deep desire to connect to other people. And it seems to me that if you show up as your true self, warts and all, as Marianne Williamson used to say, it unconsciously gives other people permission to do the same. I deeply love human interaction. I mean, I could bite you right now. I love you so much. Like, I know this is another issue with me. I used to bite my little brother who was so cute. And I feel like there are so many people that we can connect with, that we can feel outside of the prison that is, our permission. Einstein said this of only connecting with those closest to us. There's so much love out there. But if you don't give people permission to be themselves by being yourself, and if you don't lose the shame of the inevitable cracks and breaks in every human being, how can other people connect with you with their true self? So it's not fabricated. It is a tenet of my belief that we move through this world as imposters, even to ourselves from time to time. And it's easy to understand why we feel lonely, because there's no self for anybody to connect with. So yeah, it's not a technique. It's not a learned experience. It was a decision that I made many, many years ago, that which we try and hide and bury, it acts out. It goes from the unconscious into the conscious mind as a form of neuroses. And I didn't want that. So this is just me. That's it.
I do know, yeah. And it's made you connect to tens of thousands of women across the world.
Huh.
This openness. I've actually never seen it in another person.
Oh, come on.
No, I haven't. In terms of the in the Torah world, like in the Jewish world, I haven't seen it in another person, in another woman, to the extent that I've seen it in you. It's so naked.
Huh. And yet my clothes cover my whole body. Go
Yeah,
and
so
figure.
right. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about modesty. And,
Sure.
we live in obviously a time where, people are really exposing themselves and crop tops. And I go to Yorkdale and you see women in their underwear, and my kids are asking me like, why are the posters like that? Why are the women
Uh,
wearing that? My kids are little, as you know. So we live in a time of immodesty. You obviously are one of your tenets and your beliefs is about modesty. So I wanted to talk to you about modesty physically,
sure.
but I also wanted to talk to you about modesty and humility internally.
Yeah.
Because we also live in a culture where people, it's the time of the selfie.
Yeah.
I've learned from you, it was a long time ago, but I remember that the most popular word in the English language in 2013 was
That's
selfie,
right.
right? And so there is the preoccupation to put ourselves like out there and be out there. And how do we balance that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, modesty is not at its root a physical construct, although it manifests as such in, for example, traditional Jewish, or in my case, Orthodox Jewish circles. There's this idea that the body is the vessel that holds the soul. And that when we over focus on the vessel, we lose track and touch with the soul. We are souls having a physical experience as opposed to bodies that happen to have a soul. So if you go by that concept, one would want to, in some ways, diminish the expression of the body in order to draw attention to the soul, which is perfect and unflawed and requires, no adjustments, doesn't age, is ageless and eternal. And so this idea of modesty is not about embarrassment. In fact, there are many, many women who are covered from head to toe who are totally immodest because you can feel the inner intention, which is to look at me, look at my body, look at my physicality, but I'm ticking all the boxes in terms of you're not seeing my elbows or my collarbone or whatever. So I think it's an internal understanding. Modesty comes from knowing that the essence of who we are is a soul, and that soul, as I said, is perfect. God does not make junk, no garbage, no mistakes. And whatever the quirks of the physical being are, and let's face it, Kim, we know that in every generation and in every country, the standards of what is considered physical beauty change. I mean, I remember telling someone years ago that in the turn of the century, they used to have these beauty pageants in South Africa or no, on the Ivory Coast, actually, where you had to be over 200 pounds in order to enter because a woman who was too thin was perceived as either starving or abused by her husband, right? So, it depends where you go in the world. And when we look at, say, the Kardashian and Jennifer Lopez impact on society over the last 20 years, we see that the bottom, which when I was growing up had to be small and compact, right? Now needs to be. I was in Costa Rica not long ago. People get bum implants.
Yes. Here too.
Here too?
Yes. So I interviewed Dr. Jungenberg. He's
Uh-huh.
a prominent plastic surgeon in Canada,
Uh-huh.
and that's a very popular surgery.
So this is what I mean.
Brazilian butt lift, it's called.
So this is what
BBL.
the lift part could be nice, but the padding. Of course, I'm a Jewish girl. So the thing is that there is a style and a taste, and I know we all think we're living in the only generation that ever existed. But if you look at a Rubens painting, for example, to be Rubenesque, to be round and fleshy, was beautiful. So, since who was she? Wallace Simpson, you can never be too rich or too thin.
Right.
So that aesthetic has hung around for a while. And I think in many ways the thin aesthetic has hung around because it implies tremendous discipline. It also tremendously needs focus on the body. I will deprive myself. Now, of
That's,
course,
yes.
granted, there are people who are naturally that way, but for the most part, you got to work really hard on your body to be that lean. And again, for me, it's like, no, what's the point? What is the point? That body and working on that body is like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. That ship is going down no matter how hard you work at it. Or the alternative is you can die young and beautiful. And, who wants to do that?
But you are a lover of beauty.
I love beauty. I love beauty. I love aesthetics. I have never met a bouquet of flowers I didn't want to stick my nose into. And I've never looked at a pair of eyes like yours without wanting to take a picture of them. And there's never a human being that I have met that I don't kind of look at, and there's something about them. When I was a little girl, my mother told me once that we used to go to Edwards Gardens. You're from Montreal, so you may not even
No,
know
I
it.
do know
Do
Edward's
you know
Gardens.
Edwards
It's
Gardens?
beautiful, yes.
She said one day when I was like 2 or 3, I threw myself into this huge installation of tulips and I started rolling around. And it's funny. I love beauty and I'm very visually driven. But my definition of beauty is not narrow. And I love to search for, and we know beauty from a cosmetic surgery perspective is about symmetry. And so that's not that surprising given the word for peace in Hebrew is shalom, which comes from shalem, which is sort of wholeness. This notion of balance is an eternal thing. It is. But there is some of the most beautiful people in the world are slightly off.
Mhm.
And you can't, you know, you just can't. Beauty is, in my mind, a combination of innate beauty, whether it's a flower or a human being, and the environment it's planted in. And just as we know, if there's something wrong with a flower, we don't change the flower, we change the environment it's in. When we see a beautiful thing or human, we understand that the environment that human is in is going to either bring out their beauty or cast it in shadow.
That's right. Empathy makes people more beautiful when they
Yeah.
have empathy because it creates the connection.
Tell me, how do you define empathy?
So I define empathy as stepping into another person's shoes and feeling what they feel.
Uh-huh.
So not standing outside in a sort of a judgmental way,
Uh-huh.
but literally trying to embody the feelings of another person. That's
Okay.
how I define empathy. Does
Okay.
that differ from your definition of empathy?
No, I think that's a spectacular definition, and I'm just trying to think about how it applies to, what I've just shared. I'm thinking that that is a perfect definition of why I love beauty and people so much, is because I search for the spark of holiness in everyone because I want it to bond with mine, if you will.
Right.
I want to see us as rays of the same sun. And even though this one's ray may illuminate this area and this one's ray might illuminate this area, it doesn't preclude the fact that we are all from the same sun. Do you get that metaphor?
I totally get the metaphor. I love the metaphor. In fact, it's very warm in here, and my temperature just went up because because I'm so touched by that metaphor. Like I guess it's like perimenopause also, but um, when I feel emotion, I get hot. Does that happen to you too?
No.
Or I get really cold. Like if I'm upset, I get really cold, but if I get touched, I get really warm.
But you're an empath. I'm not an empath. I don't consider myself an empath. In fact, it's interesting because what I've had to work to do is to move away from the cerebral into the emotional. I actually process the world intellectually. It takes it used to take a very long time for me to move from thinking to feeling. And I think that is just a character trait. I'm head first. And if I didn't understand something intellectually, the only feeling it provoked in me was anxiety. And what I came to understand is that I had to learn to shut down the cerebral analytical intelligence and develop my emotional intelligence. so that I would be a more holistic creature, like really lived in my head. I can tell a lie, Kim, like nobody's business. I am the world's best liar. I'm ashamed to say. I don't lie anymore, but I used to get the impact or the effect that I needed, that I wanted. And in some ways, when I say this out loud, it makes me realize that I understood that the emotions I needed could be manipulated, but then I couldn't figure out why it never worked. So I have spent, I would say, 25 years working on my character traits, which were not as evolved or as balanced as they might have been. I just came out that way. I'm not damaged, wonderful childhood. I came out that way, head first, not literally. Well, actually, literally.
Oh, really? You
Not
reach?
no, not yes. I was head first, not breech.
Oh, sorry.
But I mean,
Right.
I did come out um, analytical and cerebral.
It's interesting because I think of myself as very cerebral
Do
also.
you?
I do. Yeah, I
And
do.
yet you're an empath as well.
Yes.
Oy, that's got to be a rough head to live in. Yours.
Yeah, I mean I think I have fights a lot with my head and heart
Uh huh.
because I can intellectually process something, but often my heart will try to overpower my
Uh
intellect.
huh.
But I've changed a lot over the years.
Well, having children is going to change you.
Yeah, having children, marrying a criminal lawyer has changed me
How did? Why? Why?
because it made me a lot less naive and trusting.
Uh,
And I just have eyes more wide open now to what people are capable of. And before, I used to kind of live in a world that was much more rainbows and butterflies than I do now.
huh.
So it turned on, I guess it turned on a switch when I started hearing stories from him about things that people did to their kids and their spouses and their, because I was a bit, I guess, sheltered
You
before that.
married your homework,
We all marry our homework. And that's another thing that I've learned from you is that either your kids or your spouse is
or
your homework
both,
or both.
or both.
Right. So I was telling you before we started talking just about an interaction that I had with my kids because my kids started camp, school's over. And so my daughter doesn't love change. Most people don't like change. I don't like change either. And she doesn't like change. And so I knew that the first day of camp was going to be a little bit rough. And it turned out to be a lot rough because she was really,
She lose her mind.
she lost her mind.
Did she cling to your collarbones?
No, but she was very animated. Let's just put it that way. Very, very animated and was refusing to get dressed.
Oh,
So in the morning, I saw something on Instagram. I shouldn't look at Instagram when I know I'm going to have a morning where it's going to require a lot of like patience. But I saw something that completely disrupted my emotional stability.
uh-huh.
So the town that I grew up in Montreal, there was desecration of graves at a Jewish cemetery. And I literally was shaking the whole morning. I wake up very, very early and I was so planful with my kids. And I had the lunches packed, the swimsuits, everything in the bags. And I tried to get some calm before they woke up because I was just so disrupted by seeing the desecration of these graves. And my daughter woke up and she like it was like an explosion. And I wasn't my best parent and I lost my temper. And you reminded me that I needed to have empathy for myself in that moment. And of course, that's true. And intellectually, like I knew what was happening and I knew I needed to get to a place of more sort of groundedness. But when something's happening, it's hard, right? And when you're in the midst of something where your kids are just like freaking out, I felt really guilty afterwards, like in terms of my own behavior. I was upset at my daughter, but she's 5, right? How upset can you be at a child for starting
Oh, you
something
can
new?
be upset.
You can, but I got them out of the house and I achieved that goal of actually getting her with clothes on and out of the house. And I was pushing her in the stroller and I turned to my son Sam, who's 7, and I said, Sam, I want to apologize. I didn't apologize to Maya because I wasn't ready to do that. I had to apologize to my
You
daughter.
I'm not sorry about. Yeah.
But I said to him, Sam, I want to apologize. Like I was emotionally very fragile this morning and I lost my temper. And I'm really sorry that your first day of camp started like that. And he turned to me and he said, It's okay, Mama. Sometimes it's really hard to be a parent.
Oh, God bless him.
And it made me feel worse that he said that.
Well, first of all, I'm still fixated on the fact that he understood what emotionally fragile means. Like, only in your household with your language does a 7-year-old understand that concept. That's so funny. Oh, don't ever feel bad. Honestly, that is a form of vulnerability as well. I'm not saying the screaming and yelling, which I did my share of, I can promise you. In fact, my kids can imitate me losing my mind. Apparently once, I know this is a bit off topic, but apparently once I screamed at them and I went, I'm gonna blow like a turkey. Where the heck does turkey come from? To this day, they're 33 and 29. Ma, you gonna blow like a turkey? It's like, it's I'm gonna blow like a turkey. Please tell me where that image came from. I've been searching my
It's a good
comments.
image, actually.
Hey,
I like it.
yeah,
I like it.
yeah.
So, just moving on relationships.
Okay.
Okay, we talked about kids. I want to talk about marriage and just relationships, not necessarily marriage, friendships.
Sure.
I've gotten a lot of wisdom from you over the years about
Oh.
relationships. And again, I think it's because of that vulnerability that you're so raw. I think that's the perfect word. You're very raw.
I think I'm open. I think what I am, it doesn't feel raw to me. This is actually a little piece of advice for people who are out there in the world. Do not verbally, openly process stuff you haven't worked through yet. Only share with your audience, whether as a podcaster or as a public speaker or in your employees, that which you have clarity about, so that the vulnerability is instructive as opposed to trying to turn every environment you're in into group therapy.
Right.
And that, I think, is the difference. So I have done a ton of work over my shtick. I mean, if we're talking, you did reference my mental health challenges. I was 12 when I started to develop OCD. Obsessive compulsive disorder is not moving a coaster under a drink or having to make sure your kitchen is clean. In fact, I resent it when people say I'm so OCD. I'm like, you don't know from OCD. When you start taking medication for it, when you can't get out of the house because you have to walk from your left foot to your right foot in a series of 4 times 4, when you can't get into bed because it doesn't feel right, so you have to do it over and over, when you have to repeat things, I mean, I have a million shticks, not hand washing, thank God, and also not cleaning, much to my husband's chagrin. I think he'd like a little more. He's very neat. I'm a pig, not a pig. Okay, I'm messy. Anyway, my point is that I came to see that I can't be the only person and that my life turned out fine. I was 12. My mother schlepping me to a hospital to see a psychiatrist when I was 12 years old. I tortured that guy. I used to make up dreams because I'd read somewhere that's like, it wasn't until I had my first child, no, my second child, and, antidepressants had been already evolving. And my second child, who at the time was just like maybe 4, 5, I had a baby. I was losing my mind, screaming and yelling and just freaking out. And he said, Mommy, can't you take some medicine for that? And I said, well, as a matter of fact, I can, because I'd been told by our marriage counselors that I was going to need to take something to do the work of fixing our marriage, which of course I was destroying with my insanity. And I used to blame everything on my husband. It became very clear it was mostly me. That's not true in all cases, but I had a lot of work to do. And I remember going to my GP and saying, like, what do you think? And he said, I'm going to put you on a 6-month course. Maybe you have postpartum. So I took a 6-month course of antidepressants. And at the end of it, he weaned me off them and I was fine. But I went back to him a few months later and I said, one of the things I noticed, and I've never talked about this with anybody, I said to him, is that I have all these rituals and tics, part of my OCD. And when I was on that medication, they disappeared. And he says, very interesting. They've discovered that the same antidepressants, these SSRIs that work for depression, also impact obsessive compulsive disorder. I said, well, put me back on. And I've been on it ever since. Ever since. And I thought, how many of us are moving around in that conspiracy of silence, in that what I call the mommy Olympics, nobody telling the truth about what's really going on? I mean, a friend of mine said to me the other day, my child bites. I went, so did both of mine. She said, really? I said, Kids bite. It's a developmental stage. How you handle it is going to make it worse or better. When they move on to kicking you, you'll know that they've taken a developmental leap. Anyway, well, the point is, I started taking those meds and I thought, so many people feel alone. And the first time I mentioned it, a few people came up to me afterwards and said, "Oh my God, my daughter, my son, me, whatever. Thank you, thank you." And I thought, well, this is a public service announcement. Look at how my life's turned out. Kim, I've had one successful career after another. Thank God I, started in fashion retail and as a management consultant. Then I went into television and then I went into speaking and Jewish education. Each phase of that triad were completely different and have brought me tremendous, tremendous fulfillment. And I want to say, I was completely whacked, nuts. Like you can't imagine what it was like pre-medication to be between 12 and 16, going through puberty, having like a million OCD tics, like a lot of work just to stay alive, just to stay focused. But I turned out fine. And I want women, mothers to know your kid, barring any extraordinary, unmedicatable mental health issues, your kid's going to be fine. And I wanted to be the example that they could take hope in. Yeah.
That's very generous, which leads me to my next topic, which is generosity. And I've listened to you speak a lot about generosity and loving kindness, which we see in a lot of different religions, not just Judaism. It's in every religion of the world.
Sure.
But I do like your take on generosity and kindness from a Jewish perspective.
Okay. So, first of all, the notion of generosity has manifold different manifestations. For example, givers are happy people. So if you want to raise happy, people say all the time, you say to them, what do you want for your kids when they grow up? I just want them to be happy. So that's my first disclaimer. Happiness is a byproduct of meaning. Happiness is not an end unto itself. There are plenty of times in the course of our lives where we're not happy. In fact, there's a very famous story in my family. My aunt went home to my grandmother after like 2 years of marriage and wanted to move back in. She had a little suitcase. She knocked on the door. My bubby answered the door and she said, "Ma, I want to come home. I'm just not happy." And apparently my bubby said, "Happy? You think I'm happy? Go home and make dinner," and slammed the door in her face. So in our family, when someone's unhappy, we say, "Happy? You think I'm happy?" It's our thing. Anyway, would you bring me back to where I was? I've lost my train. What was I saying?
Generosity.
Generosity.
And loving kindness.
Loving kindness, yes, and generosity. So givers are happy people. And so, if you want your child to be happy, then turn them into a giver. One of the principles in Jewish life, and I know that the church has it around tithing and so on, but there's a difference in the description of the word. We use the word tzedakah, which at its root is the word tzedek, which is righteousness, righteous obligation. From a Jewish perspective, 10 to 20% of your after-tax income does not belong to you. It's for you to redistribute and to help out making the world more equitable for everybody. And it is not a feeling that's moved by the heart. Because what if you don't feel like doing it that day? You are not off the hook. 10 to 20% of your after-tax income is not yours. It needs to be redistributed because that is your righteous obligation. And the sooner and the earlier you can teach your children, whether you're a Jew and you're doing it with 10% of their allowance or whatever faith system you're part of, to increase your child's capacity to give, whether it be their time, their volunteership, their allowance money. And by the way, I believe the purpose of allowance is to teach children that 10% of it has to be given back. Whatever it is, givers are happier people. And we are obligated to acts of loving kindness, and acts of loving kindness are not contingent on anything. They're not about us. They're about fulfilling the need of the other, even if that need doesn't speak to us. If I see you need something, it is a loving kindness on my part to give you what you need, even if it doesn't speak to me. So, yeah.
So giving is not so much a superpower as it is an obligation.
Yes, that's true from a Jewish perspective. But, speaking of superpowers, we all have them. This is an important thing to recognize. Again, from a Jewish perspective, this is Jewish philosophical perspective, but I suspect, and I don't know other religions as well, but, there's wisdom and beauty everywhere. From a Jewish perspective, each and every one of us our souls come into this world with what I like to think of as a bag of tools. In fact, the Rabbi Akiva Tatz uses this parable, which I'm going to borrow for a minute. He says, it's like God is an intelligent contractor or who sends you to a construction site. So let's imagine we're the construction workers and the construction site is our lives in the years that we live on this planet Earth. And he says that every single worker is given a bag of tools. You open that bag of tools and you look inside it. And what you see in that bag is a hint to what you're meant to be doing. So, for example, if I opened a bag on a construction site and there was steel gauntlets and a face mask and a blowtorch, I'd know I'm probably supposed to be a welder, right? And if you opened your bag and you found mortar and a putty knife and a bunch of bricks, you'd know you're a bricklayer. So our bag of tools is that which gives us a great deal of joy. It can also be that which we struggle with, but it's something that leads a big impact on how we move through the world. So if you are deeply artistic, for example, your superpower might be painting or sculpting or drawing, but not as an end unto itself. Our superpower is our innate joy, pleasure, the place where we don't even feel like we're working, our gifts, but only if they are used not as an end unto themselves, but as a way of drawing attention to the greater good, what I call God. So, for example, if I am, I'll give you a perfect example. Maybe you'll remember this. Some years back in the Canadian Olympics, there was a girl who won a bronze medal. And everybody remembers her because her mother passed away the day before she had to skate. Do you have any memory of this?
No.
Okay, so you'll look it up afterwards. And she won the bronze, and everybody talked about her for a very long time afterwards. Nobody even remembers who got the silver that year or even the gold. We all remember her because before she got on the ice, she said, I'm doing this for my mother, in the memory of my mother's soul. This is for you, Mom. And so when she attached her art or her gift or her talent or her superpower to something greater than it or her, it was memorable. When you take, like, for example, your superpower and probably your super tormentor is being an empath. But when you use that tool in your bag to create an empathy empire, to take what comes naturally to you and to teach other people that it's learnable and it's developable, and you interview people and talk about it, and you create your exquisite jewelry that you create, along with having a factor of charity that goes along with it, and the kind of people you have that stitch it and who you're going to hire to do the work. All of that is the use of your superpower as an empath to make a difference in the world. It's not enough to have something you're good at if you're not using it to further the good in the world. And we all have a superpower, each and every one of us. And sometimes, it's interesting, sometimes our superpower is the thing we struggle with the most. Why? Because if we can get to a place where we can share our strength and hope and experience and loss and struggles with someone else who has that, that can be enough. That can be your entire life to be able to say, I get that. Here's what helps me. How can I help you? So the superpower itself, we got to stop focusing on what it is and focus on what we're using it for.
I love that. I think that's a perfect way for us to end. Thank you, Adrienne Gold Davis.
Oh, you're so welcome, Kim Smiley. I adore you. Let's put our bracelets together. Here we are.
Yeah.
Yeah, super women. I love you.
I love you too.